Welcome to Missions Moment, the podcast of the Krapf Project. This is episode 11. My name is Calvin, and today we're going to drop in on a conversation I had with Aaron recently about our newest project, which is a new edition of John Flavel's exposition of the Westminster Assembly's Shorter Catechism. We discuss a little bit about John Flavel's life and times in this conversation. He was a Puritan Presbyterian minister in 17th century England. We also get into a bunch of other interesting topics, and I hope you enjoy and profit from that whole conversation. Let's dive in. Well, one thing we're looking forward to taking the wraps off of, that was a sentence I should try again. One thing, the wraps of which we are looking forward to removing, is John Flavel's exposition of the Shorter Catechism. Today, I spent some time writing up the introduction, which kind of reviews Flavel's life and ministry a little bit. And yeah, there's kind of a few interesting things, actually. So he's born around 1630, maybe a little earlier, but he would have been about between 12 and 14 years old when the English Civil War broke out in the early 1640s, Parliament versus the King and all that. And then he studied at Oxford later in the 1640s as a teenager. And by the end of the 1640s, the Westminster Assembly had finished the Confession and Catechisms. Those came out in 1647 and 48.
Right.
The Civil War had finished. Flavel had finished his Oxford education, and Charles I had been finished off. He was beheaded in the year before Flavel was ordained as a pastor in 1650. So it was quite an eventful decade, both for him and for the nation.
What denomination was he?
He's Presbyterian.
Ordained in the Presbyterian Church.
Yeah, I mean, the denominational, at least as institutions, a lot of things weren't totally clear. It was the Church of England, and then during the Civil War, the Church of England was up for debate what kind of church it was going to be. And Flavel would have been of Presbyterian convictions, but he was a minister in the Church of England, as far as I can understand it. And then as debates continued about what kind of church the Church of England would be, Flavel experienced much of that, the twisting and turning.
Was he a dissenter in the end, or did he stay and die in the Church of England?
Well, yeah, so he was a dissenter, meaning, of course, he when the king and the monarchy was restored under James in 1662, there was an act of uniformity that required all pastors and congregations in the Church of England to return to using the Book of Common Prayer in their worship. And Flavel was one of the, I think, close to 2,000 ministers who resigned their living rather than submit to that requirement.
Right.
And there's all sorts of interesting situations that got him into. I mean, there's stories of him preaching at midnight in a barn, preaching out in the woods. At one point, there was another law that required dissenting ministers to preach only more than 5 miles from a town. Like, they couldn't preach within 5 miles of a town. He would preach he moved to a village that was 5 miles away from Dartmouth, where he was the pastor before, and he preached there. And that lasted for a long time. It was 1672, I think. There was a bit of relief, but then the relief was removed, and it was well into the 80s when it was still dangerous for Flavel to be ministering. He actually fled to London, I think, in 82. And then he had to flee London back to Dartmouth, both times to secure his safety. And then finally, 1688, I mean, anyone familiar with the story will know that's when William of Orange rolled in and restored freedom for dissenting ministers.
Right.
And there was some comment that Flavel made about how he felt like a worn-out veteran of a long war after 25 years of being on the run as a pastor. So it would have been certainly a very taxing time to be a pastor.
There were, of course, not only Presbyterian dissenters, but dissenters were typically known more so, perhaps, among Baptists and Congregational.
Yeah, there was a wide variety. It was a lot of those, even those identities were kind of up in flux. Congregational, Presbyterian. I mean, it was kind of all up for debate at the time. Between Baptists and Presbyterian would have been more of a doctrinal difference, but between many Congregationalists and Presbyterians, it was kind of a practical difference.
The most popular, most well-known, perhaps, dissenter was John Bunyan.
Yeah, and this would have been just about the same time. So the aftermath, the generation following the work of the Westminster Assembly. That's another kind of interesting thing. Flavel was ordained 3 years after the assembly wrote the confession and was one of the first generation of ministers to use the confession and catechisms. He essentially field tested the catechism for the rest of us. He was kind of the pilot project, so that was kind of a cool thing to think
Well, he was
about.
a young man. What age was he when he was ordained?
Yeah, only about 20. Yeah, it would maybe 22, depending on, we don't know exactly. I think there's some debate about exactly when he was born, but he was either 20 or 22 or something like that. And he only lived till he was 64.
What
He
was his
died of
family situation? Did he marry?
Sorry?
His family situation?
He married 4 times. I don't know exactly what caused.
When I asked the question, I wasn't expecting a minefield.
yeah. He didn't marry 4 women at the same time or anything. And I mean, I assume that means that 3 of his wives died, at least. But I didn't get any more info there. I saw their names, but I didn't know. It's a fascinating thing. There's some people in history you almost know every detail. Like, I mean, we know from Luther what his favorite beer was that relieved his constipation, right? From John Owen, I mean, nothing in Owen's writings indicates that he lost something like 7 children in infancy.
I think he had 1 daughter who outlived him.
Yeah, it was a huge number of children that he lost. And similarly from Flavel, I mean, I haven't read everything he's written, but I've read quite a bit of it, and I've never gotten any indication that he was...
an interesting study, the families of the Puritans and the struggles, Bunyan's little blind daughter.
Yep. I mean, it's one thing to think about preaching in the woods. It's kind of fun. It almost sounds fun. I mean, I'm learning that in California. I'm preaching outside these days because present we're not allowed to be inside our building, and that's the way that. Yeah, not in that sense right now. Yeah, but in a way, it could sound sort of adventurous to be preaching in an unusual situation, but it sure is a lot of extra work, and it's not as convenient, and it's harder for people. And then you think about families and how they're affected, and being on the run from the authorities and all that sort of thing would certainly put a toll on your family. So that was quite a poignant comment, to be a veteran who's endured a long war. That really stuck with me as a description of what it was like to be a pastor at the time.
The Baptists at that time used to preach sometimes behind a curtain with a trapdoor.
Oh, wow.
So that if the authorities came, the speaker was hidden. And if the authorities came, he could escape through the trapdoor.
I might do that just to avoid angry congregation members getting rid of me.
Right.
One of the reasons I've appreciated Pastor Flavel for a long time is he preaches in an incredibly clear way.
So this catechism, the question and answers, is analogous to how he normally preached?
I don't know if I'd say that, although there's certainly some of that clarity and system in his preaching. He'll kind of address a topic and then divide it into parts and then point out the applications of it. But what he does in these is he'll take a question and answer the catechism, and then he'll ask a bunch more study questions to kind of draw out particular details, and then answer it and provide a few scripture references. And then the last 3 to 5 questions in each chapter is, what's the first practical application? What's the second practical application? And some of them are incredibly useful. There's one about parenting, actually, that's really stuck with me from the chapter on original sin. And he says, what's one of the practical applications of understanding original sin? And the answer is Christian parents should be very understanding towards their children, since all their faults came to them through us. Okay. And that's something I've had more than one occasion to recall in my own relationship with my children.
They came by it honestly.
They sure did. Yeah. My poor kids got all of my original sin. Thankfully, I didn't have that much to begin with, unlike your kids.
I know. How have you found it beneficial? Because you've used it in your church.
Yeah, I've used it in 2 ways. One is as sort of cheat sheet material for preaching on certain subjects. If there's any pastors out there who are planning to preach on the 10 Commandments, or any particular doctrine like the Incarnation or the Trinity, or I've used it to preach about the means of grace, for instance, like preaching and prayer and sacraments. And I've just found it helpful as a clue where to go in scripture, how to explain something, what issues need to be covered in teaching on a certain subject. The other way I've used it is just in leading Bible studies. So one thing I've done just to save time is just kind of give everybody a copy of this and we just read it together and chat about it.
Yeah. And when I was pastoring in Victoria, I should have kept wheels turning that were already turning rather than reinventing the wheels. I would advise a young pastor to do that, to use material that's already there, make it your own, of course, and cite it.
Yep.
Don't plagiarize,
Yep.
use the material. See, it's
And the other,
you can milk many cows, but you can mix your own cream.
yeah, that's right. I mean, the other good thing about it is that it can kind of accomplish two goals at once, because even if people don't remember some of what we talked about, at least they certainly remember where we got it from, and they'll be able to go back and have a little bit of knowledge about how to get at some of these answers that we want them to know about. Flavel, I think, was quite expert at boiling down a subject into its bare form. He was capable of writing long books, like most of the Oxford-trained scholastic Reformed theologians of his day.
The volumes, I think there's 6 volumes in his collected works, isn't there?
That's right. Many of which are sermons. At least one of them is more of an academic theology work. It's called, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce this, but Pneumatologia, a treatise on the soul. Mm-hmm. And it's a very detailed kind of analytical treatment of the subject of the soul. Mm-hmm. So he was capable of writing that sort of thing. But the nice thing about that style of training that he had was it could be a big book, or its outline could be a very small book. And really that's what these questions and answers amount to. It's just sort of you could write a massive book just using these questions and answers as an outline, but in outline form, they're very nice and accessible.
Would you recommend a pastor in a Presbyterian church modeling his Sunday evening service after the Dutch Reformed pastors who go through the Heidelberg Catechism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Have you ever done that? I'll just answer your question with another question.
No.
So the way I've done that is I have never preached on the text of the Catechism. I don't think that's what I would advocate. Usually I find that the best way to do it is to just choose a text in Scripture that addresses a subject. Mm-hmm. So for instance, one way that I did this is I preached on each of the 5 articles of the Canons of Dort a couple years ago on the 400th anniversary of Dort. I don't remember offhand which text I used, but I just chose a text that taught the perseverance of the saints. I believe it was from 2 Timothy, where Paul talks about how Christ will bring him safely into his heavenly kingdom. Mm. And I preached on the doctrine from there. And I told everybody I was preaching about this subject, but I used the text to do it. So that's the way I've done that.
Well, I presume the Dutch did it initially so that they would have, perhaps for a number of reasons, but they would have a full-orbed teaching, catechizing of the congregation. And Sunday night was the time to do that. But I don't know if I would advocate doing it as a stipulated part of my ministry. I find it would make me lazy. Just so that if you have your Sunday already prepared, your Sunday evenings already prepared in the last year, you just regurgitate what you've already done. So.
Either lazy or really stressed out, maybe, because you got to come up with a new sermon on the same subject. Maybe the 5th year in a row, right?
Well, that could be what they
do. I don't believe it's usually, or at least always, recycled sermons from a year ago. Right. But it certainly could present a temptation to do that. However it's done, though, I think the thing that most churches outside of the Dutch Reformed tradition could learn from that is just the real importance of not only detailed exposition of particular parts of Scripture. We all know about the 5-year-long series in Romans or something, right? That's a big highlight of any pastor's ministry. But even a very well-balanced and mature preacher can't count on having his congregation stick around long enough to get a balanced diet of preaching if you're going through a passage of Scripture one verse at a time for years. So, I mean, some of the Puritans they probably had people for their whole life, and they were already well catechized, so you could go ahead and preach on Psalm 119 for 2 years straight or something.
Well, I forget how many years Joseph Carroll preached through Job. I think it was
right. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
years, it was decades.
And there may be, I mean, certainly judging from history, it seems that there are very particularly gifted men who are capable of nourishing believers with that kind of ministry. But most of us, especially in the modern world where people stick around for a year or two before moving on for a new job frequently, we need to get the basics of the faith across to people quicker
Right, right.
than
But
once every 10 years.
even among the best expositors, their congregations have turnover.
So there's the gifting question, but there's also the circumstance question.
Yeah.
And most of us are in a circumstance where we should be thinking about how can I spend at least some time every year getting to the main things
And
that
the
every Christian needs to know.
method of going through the Heidelberg every year, I suppose, covers that issue.
Yeah.
So what's the goal for this project?
There's really two goals. One is to let people start using it. By selecting a portion of the whole work, we get to do that a little bit quicker. The other goal is to try and help people learn about the Krapf Project and what we're doing.
Right.
And we're hoping that, for instance, people might like to buy this as a Christmas gift for their pastor, or indeed for their husband or dad who's leading family worship. I think that would be a really good use for this. Or really anyone who's kind of interested in theology and learning about the Bible. A lot of new Christians could use this and just grow quite a bit in their grasp of Scripture and how it all fits together.
Mm-hmm.
This will be a good sample of what the Krapf Project's really about, which is equipping people with good resources to do the work they're already doing, but hopefully in a way that will have even more lasting value. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Missions Moment. We hope this conversation was a blessing and a benefit to you. Please keep your eye out for news about this new edition of Flavel's exposition of the Shorter Catechism. We're hoping to make it available for you to order well before Christmas time rolls around. And in the meantime, we look forward to joining with you again in a couple of weeks.